Professional wrestling is pretty cool. At its best, you get to see talented athletes tell compelling stories through the performative sport that is wrestling. Some of the biggest names in the industry feel larger than life, mythical even, but very few talents actually start with that status. Most have to claw their way from the bottom, enduring corny personas and backstage politics on their way to finally reaching the pinnacle of the business. And for some, that also involves eating a ton of pinfalls. Even if you're not a wrestling fan, you've probably heard of the term jobber before. It's basically a derogatory word people use to describe a performer who loses a lot. They're doing the job by making the other competitor look good and enhancing the experience. Every wrestler is bound to lose their fair share of matches, but the jobber status generally only applies to people who consistently embody a losing role. This ranges from your local, nameless independent, who gets squashed in 2 minutes and never shows up again, to a man like Kurt Hawkins, whose defining storyline for several months was a consecutive losing record of well over 200. His jobber status was so spectacular that it eventually led to a championship match on WWE's grandest stage. Yep, that's right, he lost so many matches that he got a title shot and won. No, that doesn't make any sense from a competitive standpoint, but from a storytelling perspective, it caps off a textbook underdog narrative. Wrestlers are real people, but they're also characters in a larger story, and it's through effective storytelling that the role of a jobber can be used constructively. Outside of pro wrestling, you can find jobber characters in pretty much any story that centers around competition or action, though you normally won't find them bouncing back in as grand a fashion as our boy Kurt Hawkins. Wrestling's endless narrative web and revolving door of stars makes it much more likely for roles to shift over time in a way that not even the great One Piece can properly emulate, though it's probably the best fictional example I'm aware of. Someone like Buggy first appears as a seemingly one-off antagonist, and yet each new time he returns to be the butt of a joke, his influence only grows. Despite being a jobber of sorts, he is rewarded for the same persistence displayed by other recurring characters, which makes him both a reflection of the story's broader thematic vision, as well as a more dynamic personality in his own right. With that in mind, he's almost too important to represent the core essence of what a jobber generally is. On an alignment chart of combatants based around their relevance and capabilities, you'd typically find the jobber exclusively scattered throughout the bottom left, with the top right reserved for shonen protagonists and overarching villains, the big name players. The position itself isn't really built for flexibility or nuance after all. You show up, you lose, you leave. That's often the extent of a jobber's screen time, even in cases where they're fortunate enough to get multiple appearances. So effective jobbing is less about longevity and more about maximizing the minimal. Some villains of the week are best done away with in a single blow, but after so many instances of randos puffing themselves up to be the best ever, look at this special technique, I'm definitely an important character, the routine of them getting blown out by the clearly more important protagonist can feel not only stale, but like a sideshow distraction from actual ongoing plot threads. In an ideal story, even the squash matches would serve as either a small contributor to the arc's broader theme, or as a point of tonal balance or juxtaposition. So while anything less wouldn't exactly be a narrative failing, we are talking about minor details after all, it would feel like a potential missed opportunity. The Maze Castle arc of Yu Yu Hakusho has a fight where the previous villain comes back to be killed by his supposed ally, and while this plays into the exact same trope of jobbing for the sake of scale, it serves multiple purposes. While emphasizing the threat posed by this new enemy, this betrayal also ties into Hiei's character arc of placing trust in his comrades. A single sword stroke goes from merely an impressive feat of strength to a piece of personal growth. Yusuke's trust in Hiei was rewarded earlier in the arc because loyalty is something Hiei values, and so in relation to that, Hiei gets revenge on behalf of the betrayed, paying condolences to a former foe in spite of their despicable acts. It's a rare glimpse at the soft boy hidden beneath the edgy exterior, a brief encapsulation of the duality that makes Hiei such a memorable character. The antagonist who gets slain here is of such little importance that I don't even remember his name, yet he still manages to serve a vital purpose to the overall story. He is a brilliant jobber, a relative irrelevant worthy of reverence. But is he the best? At this point, we've outlined the two axes on the alignment chart of jobberdom, and we've taken a look at the two extremes of importance. Ice Guy from May's Castle gets done away with in one move in one chapter. Buggy continues to return and evolve as a character, thus gaining status within the world of One Piece. Both add something of value to the stories they're a part of, even while existing on opposite ends of the spectrum, which goes to show that any kind of jobber can improve a story in the right context. That said, it's also possible for a more important character to be a bigger disappointment than even the most irrelevant fodder. Yamcha from Dragon Ball can only lose to so many opponents before he sacrifices the facade of being a serious threat. Though his status as relevant fodder isn't entirely negative, his first round losses in all 3 of his World Martial Arts tournaments basically destroyed the notion that he would ever hold a candle to his peers, but his death in the fight against the Saiyans was an effective tone shift that heightened the stakes of that arc. As Mr. Fusion from Dragon Ball Dissection put it, the cast initially treats the imposing threat like a tournament, a chance for them to show off the fruits of their training like they were used to in the past. Once Yamcha dies, there's a sense of urgency. No one is safe. And for Yamcha to be the guy who gets that idea across, in spite of how predictable it would seem given his prior track record, speaks to the compelling drama Toriyama was capable of creating at his best. It doesn't make Yamcha any less of a one-note character, but it's a silver lining. Conceptually, I find the relevant fodder category to be the least interesting in the context of competitive stories, because it almost inherently necessitates stagnation, something which is antithetical to the friendship, effort, victory motto of magazines like Shonen Jump. It's really hard to write like a Team Rocket style villain into a narrative that is all about escalation, because you keep having the characters come back, but not change. That's not to say that a character whose arc that centers around stagnation can't be engaging, it's just something that would have to be handled really carefully to avoid repetition. And even then, they'd probably just end up sliding into the Buggy category, where they gain some kind of importance or improvement, and they gain that capability. And once they gain that capability, they're not really fodder. So with 3 of the 4 quadrants out of the way, we finally reach my personal favorite, the capable yet irrelevant. This is where you'll find characters who appear once, maybe twice, but who manage to lose in such a spectacular fashion that you can't help but admire them. Don't forget that the role of a jobber is to enhance the experience. A more charitable interpretation of the term would be enhancement talent. And in some cases, that might even involve tricking the viewer into thinking said character might actually win. Iwasa from Baby Steps is my second favorite example of this. Not only is his style of tennis completely different from anything else we see in the anime, but he also serves to reinforce the gap between players who aim for the pros and players who play for fun. Baby Steps is a series about throwing everything you have at the things you're passionate about. And so after defeating Iwasa, who used tennis as a means to an end rather than the end itself, Achan is forced to question how much of himself he's willing to dedicate to his craft. Will he sacrifice his studies for the sake of challenging greater heights in the realm of tennis, or is he content to stand beneath a low ceiling if it means preserving his high marks? Iwasa's conviction was weak not only on the court, where he would literally quit in the middle of a rally, but off the court as well. For as skilled as he was, he admitted to only training out of obligation. This put him at odds with Achan's hyperfixation on improvement, and so as the game dragged on, Iwasa's unconditioned body eventually quit on him, a physical representation of his lack of commitment. As the tournament's 3rd seed, Iwasa could hardly be considered fodder. His unorthodox habit of turning tennis into art made him a bizarre and memorable character, but more importantly, the flaws in his approach built into the themes put forth in this arc. He bows out from competition after this, but even in a diminished role where he simply practices tennis casually, he still adds an extra dimension to the story. Conviction means everything to those who define themselves through their passions. But not everyone has to define themselves that way. For people like Achan and his rivals, tennis was everything. But for Iwasa, tennis was just tennis. And that's okay. A character's status in combat narratives often boils down to their ability to compete, and so anyone with a lower power level will inevitably be cast aside. But retiring from relevance doesn't have to be the end of the road. Iwasa doesn't abandon tennis just because he didn't desire to go professional, and that brand of commitment is valuable too. Iwasa manages to stand out while simultaneously fitting right into the framework of Baby Steps, elevating the story without ever taking it over. His position is minor, but constructive. He's a phenomenal example of what a capable jobber can be. But he's not number 1. He's close, but I can do one better. It's all come down to this. The search for the greatest jobber character in all of anime, except for the ones I haven't seen, leads us to every villain in Part 2 of Naruto. Yes, post-time skip, we're introduced to the Akatsuki, an evil organization headed by Pain Nagato, who it turns out was actually being manipulated by Tobi/Obito, who it turns out was actually being manipulated by the real mastermind, Madara Uchiha, the world's favorite undead chakra daddy, who it turns out was actually the biggest jobber of them all, designed only to put over Kaguya Otsutsuki, the 5-time WWE champion, conqueror of The Undertaker's WrestleMania undefeated streak. Sorry, I got a little carried away there. No, the real winner is some dude named Kaito. No, not that one. This one. His opening conflict with Kurama sets the tone for what the battles in Chapter Black are all about. Mind games, misdirection, scenarios which might not be decided strictly by who has the most raw power. It's an important distinction to establish hot off the heels of the Yusuke-Toguro clash. Then, when he returns for the Game Master section, he gets utterly demolished despite his own impressive display of talent, which further emphasizes just how legitimate a threat Amanuma poses. Answering the first question after just 2.5 words immediately conveys the sheer amount of time and effort he had to put into memorizing the quiz at hand, which puts him in stark contrast to someone like Yusuke, whose experience with strictly fighting games leaves him completely useless. In the manga, at least. The anime tries to soften the blow by having him fight a level 1 mook, but still, the fact that he's not in the final fight, or the fact that he's not even reserved for the final fight as someone to be relied on, shows that he's outclassed here. Kaito's got the one-up on Yusuke, the protagonist of the story, in this one particular environment. Yet even Kaito's abilities pale in comparison to Amanuma, who memorized the goddamn algorithm that organizes the questions. Kaito winds up completely outclassed once again, but even in the face of such overwhelming odds, he doesn't give up. He still tries to guess at answers randomly, because even taking a chance on pure luck is better than doing nothing. Kaito, more like Fighto, that kind of never give up attitude, even in the most minor of moments, cuts right to the core of what makes the shonen aesthetic so fun and interesting to dissect. Kaito is just an average human, swept up in a supernatural storm of demons and superhumans. Heck, he's not even a fighter. He's a non-battle jobber giving his all in a world of battle. And he's used in a way that not only makes him look capable, but makes his actions kind of inspiring. He's a tiny speck in the grand scheme of things, a minor member of the cast whose biggest contributions end up being his own losses, but those defeats go well beyond the bare minimum of putting the guy over. He is, without question, the quintessential shonen jobber. As I joked about earlier, this discussion was, of course, limited to the shows that I'm familiar with, which is why I'd love to hear about other jobber characters I didn't mention here. The feedback on my Insecure Shonen Protagonist video put some new stories on my radar, and I think it'd be cool if something similar happened in the comments of this one. Special thanks to King Kevin 30, Stone Cold 007, Roggle, Jackerknife, and all of my other patrons for supporting the channel, and an extra special thank you to this absolute legend for making this art of Madara as John Bradshaw Layfield. I made the reference in my Naruto Passing the Torch video. I want my damn torch back! Ever since I made that, I wanted to see some sort of art as it. So go follow them, check out their art. It's good. Anyways, we'll catch you in the next video.